If extreme heat could destroy human will, then the floods that were about to come would completely destroy human civilization. Several hours later, the sky filled with gray clouds and it started raining heavily. Everyone was happy and thought that finally the temperature was going to drop. But what no one expected was for a flood to occur. Despite the fact that the city of Chengdu was not close to the sea, it could not escape from the flood. A huge wave appeared in the city and began to devastate everything in its path, causing panic among the citizens. The engineering university was not located in a high area, so only the administrative building was tall enough to avoid being flooded by water. Meanwhile, Suchan, who had completely absorbed the crystal core of the snake, took off his shirt and submerged himself in the water. He began to dive and had no doubt that indeed, by absorbing the crystal core of the snake, one could obtain a new supernatural power and thus experience new changes in their body. Now Suchan had scales on his face just like the snake, and he was even able to see underwater. He stared at the ground and thought that after coming into contact with water, not only did small scales grow all over his body, but there was also a significant increase in strength. His eyes became more sensitive to light and had a protective membrane in front of them. He began to look at his hand, and since he was underwater at this moment, he couldn't breathe through his mouth or nose. But despite this, he didn't feel any sensation of suffocation. He felt as if he were breathing through his skin. He didn't know if this was a characteristic of the water snake. He started swimming and emerging towards the surface. And although this power didn't allow him to control the water, being able to breathe underwater was also very good, especially now that the whole city was flooded. In a matter of minutes, the water level began to rise and flooded almost half of the buildings. Now only the tallest ones remained. Suchan emerged from the water, closed his eyes, and thought that the floods were coming from the direction of Hotel Green City. If he tried to go against the current, it wasn't impossible. There was just one problem. The flow of water was so violent that submerged objects were like hidden blades. Suchan turned his head to one side, started looking up at the sky, wiped his chin with his hand, and came to the conclusion that the volcanic eruption had reached its limits and cities were too far from the volcano, and the sky was quite clear. But when a large amount of volcanic ash would rise into the air, covering everything and darkening daytime, they wouldn't be far from winter's end. While the raindrops were falling on Suchan's face, he thought that in these final days, human civilization was nothing more than a simple joke. They didn't want to be cannon fodder, they just wanted to improve their own strength. Thinking this, he couldn't help but feel furious because in his previous life, after the Great Flood, several powerful forces emerged in the city. The area to the north of the city became a watery zone due to its low terrain, and it was occupied by a large army of aquatic beings in human form, led by the water serpent and the Queen of Corpses. To the south of the city, monsters in the shape of ogres appeared, a cannibal tribe known as the Glutton Clan. The rats evolved, and the west of the city was under the control of the rat army subordinate to King Rat. And finally, the east of the city, where Hotel Green City's destroyer was located, was dominated by force and violence. In his previous life, he was on the verge of death several times at their hands. With a serious look, he began to gaze off to the side and remembered that in this life, the matter of Gao King and Ming Shi had already been resolved by him beforehand. To continue being strong, the best way was to obtain the remaining crystal cores. Several minutes later, he went to a higher area that wasn't flooded, placed a hand on his knee, turned his head to the side, and came to the conclusion that there was a large number of members from the cannibal tribe who were divided into different factions. However, the Corpse Queen was very mysterious when it came to her whereabouts, making it even more difficult now to find her. In his previous life, the Technology University experienced a mouse plague, so King Rat should be there. And as long as he found it in advance, he could obtain the crystal core from it with less effort. Suchan was sitting on a rock, with one arm resting on his leg and the other on his knee. Below him, there was a pile of monsters staring at him, waiting for him to dive into the water. Looking down, he saw that he was surrounded by monsters. Seeing this, he realized that he had relaxed too much. In a matter of hours, the water level rose so much that the only thing left in the lower area of the city was a communication tower. In this tower, there were two men who were holding onto the pole. They were quite confused and amazed as they didn't know how this great flood had occurred. The bald man turned his head back and saw someone approaching them quickly. Upon seeing this, he couldn't help but be amazed and informed his brother that someone was swimming towards them in the water. The man beneath him started looking at his brother and asked him not to be so surprised, as at this moment, even if there was someone in the water, it was most likely that they were dead. Several seconds later, the man turned his head back, and upon seeing what his eyes were witnessing, he couldn't help but be shocked. The person approaching them was none other than Suchan. Upon looking more closely, the man immediately recognized him. It was surprising for them since he hadn't been drowned by the flood yet. He began to look at Suchan with a surprised look and couldn't help but clench his teeth tightly. If it weren't for the fact that they had been sent to watch over Suchan, he and his brother wouldn't have encountered the flood. He decided to kick him and forcefully throw him into the water if he dared to approach them. The bald man started looking back and explained to his brother that Suchan was too fast. As he looked more closely, he saw that there seemed to be something behind him. Seeing this, he couldn't help but get nervous and start sweating. Upon hearing this, his brother began to look at him with a surprised expression and asked him what he was talking about. As he looked more closely, the bald man saw that many monsters were chasing Suchan. They both didn't know what those monsters were. Despite Suchan swimming at a very high speed against the current thanks to the crystal core, the monsters were not far behind as they were also swimming at a very fast pace. Suchan began swimming towards the communication tower, and upon seeing this, the bald man held onto the pole even tighter and couldn't help but panic. With a serious voice, he warned him not to approach them as they belonged to the evolution base. Suchan began to stare at the bald man, and upon realizing that they belonged to the evolution base, and they had extended their claws so much in this life, he thought he had come across them just in time. He decided to find out what was going on. He took a big leap and started moving towards them. Both of them turned their heads to the side, and upon seeing this, they were shocked as they couldn't believe that he had jumped so high despite being in the water. Suchan began to approach the bald man, and upon seeing this, his expression changed drastically. With a surprised look, he started wondering what he was planning to do. Suchan stepped on his face, causing him to tightly clench his teeth and let go of the pole in the process. He began to fall towards the water and couldn't help but scream and ask for help. His brother turned his head downwards, and upon seeing this, he was in shock and started sweating. He wasn't determined to let his brother fall into the water, so without hesitating for a second, he grabbed him by the hand. He held onto the pole tightly with his legs, and while holding onto the pole with one hand, he grabbed his brother's arm with the other. And because the bald man was heavy, he closed his eyes, clenched his teeth tightly, and asked him to hold onto the pole quickly. He started looking at his brother and explained that he couldn't do it because the pole was too far away. Little by little, the man's strength began to fade. He closed his eyes, clenched his teeth tightly, and asked his brother not to worry because he was not going to let go of him. Upon seeing this, the bald man panicked. He started looking at his brother and told him that if he was too heavy, then he could let go of him, since if they continued like this, both would die. But he refused as he was not willing to give up and let go of him. If they were going to die, then they would do it together. Meanwhile, Suchan climbed up the communication tower, sat on the railing, placed both hands on his knees, started looking at them, and asked them to tell him all the information they knew about the evolution base. The man who had his eyes closed and was holding his brother's arm refused as he was not willing to reveal the information to Suchan. He believed that even if they died, someone else would avenge them. Upon hearing this, Suchan couldn't help but praise him for being brave and asked him not to blame him then. While they were talking, the monsters approached them and began to emerge from the water. One of them reached its hand up and grabbed the bald man's leg. The monster forcefully pulled his leg, causing his brother to let go of his hand, and he fell into the water. While little by little the bald man was falling into the water, he reached out his hand towards his brother's hand, and with a desperate look, he began to scream and ask for help. Suchan started to look at his brother with a serious gaze and explained that it was himself who had gotten into trouble, so they couldn't blame him. Upon seeing his brother falling into the water and being surrounded by monsters, he couldn't help but panic. Without hesitating for a second, he also jumped into the water as he was determined to save him. Both of them fell into the water and submerged. At that moment, a monster opened its mouth and started approaching him. The man opened his eyes, turned his head to one side, and upon seeing this, clenched his teeth tightly and panicked. Upon seeing that the monster was ready to attack, he turned his head to the side and with a desperate look, thought he was doomed. He closed his eyes and prepared himself for the attack. But at that moment, Suchan jumped from the communication tower, plunged into the water, and using his sword ended the monster's life. The man emerged from the water, and the monsters nearby prepared to attack, but Suchan took out the swords from the system's inventory, started moving at an incredible speed, and in the blink of an eye, began killing all the monsters. Several seconds later, the bald man also emerged from the water and began panting heavily to catch his breath. The other man turned his body to one side, and upon seeing that Suchan had killed all the monsters, he came to the conclusion that he was too strong. He couldn't help but be amazed and wonder if he was truly human. Suchan pulled the two brothers out of the water, and all three climbed up to the communication tower. They thanked him and thought that they really owed him a favor now. They decided to tell him everything they knew. In reality, they had been sent from the evolution base to monitor him. The bald man, who had his body leaning against the railing, began to pant heavily and explained to him that the evolution base was at the technology university, with Leader Liu in charge of the research laboratory as its core. The other man, who also had his body leaning against the railing and was also gasping for breath, explained to him that they were only doing some practical work, following their superior's orders. Suchan simply stared at them and remained silent. He remembered that the rat plague in his past life had also occurred at the University of Technology. Connecting the dots, he realized it was related to the evolution base. With a calm look, he asked them if there were mutant rats in the research laboratory. The man started looking at Suchan and explained to him that they had no idea about this matter since only the research staff could enter the laboratory. Upon hearing this, his expression changed drastically. With a determined look, he decided to go investigate the situation at the technology university and take action before the rat plague outbreak. At the same time, waves of floodwater began to crash against the Green City Hotel, and Duenya, who was inside, luckily obtained a crystal core from the monster's brain. She absorbed the crystal nucleus, started looking down with a confused look, and began to scream. While she was sitting at the table and breathing heavily, she extended her hands to the sides, started staring at them intently, and wondered if she had succeeded. The floodwater entered the hotel, filling Suchan's room floor. She put her foot on the ground and felt surprised to see that the water level had risen so much. At that moment, some tentacles began approaching her. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.